Burke County, Georgia, 1839. Behind the whitewashed columns of Willow Bend Plantation, a secret festered that was so grotesque, so unthinkable, that generations after would still whisper about it only in half-truths. On the surface, Willow Bend was the picture of Southern wealth, cotton fields stretching across the horizon, enslaved men and women toiling in silence, and a mistress of the house known for her rigid discipline and icy composure. But beneath that polished veneer, something darker was unfolding. 17 people dead in just over a year, physicians burning their records, entire pages ripped from county archives. And in the middle of it all, Cordelia Rutledge, a woman whose obsession with youth, bloodlines, and revenge led her to perform chilling dawn rituals in the waters of Turkey Creek. What began as grief spiraled into something monstrous, a practice so disturbing it blurred the line between medicine, superstition, and madness. And when the truth was finally uncovered, it would shatter more than just a family legacy. It would expose the darkest side of the Old South. Before we dive deeper into this chilling true story, make sure you hit that like button to support the channel, subscribe if you love uncovering hidden chapters of history, and share this video with a friend who's into dark mysteries. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. In the fertile heart of Burke County, Georgia, stood Willow Bend Plantation, 1,400 acres of cotton fields, rolling pastures, and forest land stitched together into what seemed like a monument to prosperity. On the surface, Willow Bend represented everything the antebellum South prided itself on: order, refinement, and the illusion of stability built on the backs of enslaved labor. The main house rose like a sentinel above Turkey Creek, a 3-story federal-style mansion with gleaming white columns that caught the sunlight and projected wealth to anyone who approached. To visitors, Willow Bend seemed alive with the hum of activity, servants moving swiftly through the halls, field hands bending low under the blistering Georgia sun, and Cordelia Rutledge, the mistress of the estate, orchestrating it all with the precision of a military commander. But beneath that immaculate facade, the plantation carried a tension, an unspoken heaviness, as if the land itself knew that something was brewing, something that could not be contained by polished manners or draped curtains. Even before the tragedies began, Willow Bend had whispers attached to it, the kind of quiet rumors exchanged in kitchens, taverns, and churchyards, that the Rutledge family carried secrets deeper than the roots of the cypress trees that lined Turkey Creek. To the wealthy neighbors of Burke County, Willow Bend was a success story. Its cotton fields produced bales upon bales of white gold that fed the mills of England. Its enslaved population was organized into efficient labor units, and its main house regularly hosted dinner parties, where politics and prosperity were toasted over imported wines. But if you were one of the enslaved workers who lived in the shadow of those fields, Willow Bend looked and felt different. The rhythm of life was strict, suffocating even, with every detail accounted for under Cordelia's watchful gray eyes. She supervised not just the household, but the smallest aspects of life: the weaving of cloth, the measurements of food, the tending of gardens. The enslaved men and women often remarked that she seemed less like a mistress and more like a scientist observing specimens, always watching, always noting details, as if preparing for some larger purpose no one else could quite name. Even in those years before her husband's death, people noticed the oddities: the medical texts she ordered from Philadelphia, the long hours she spent writing by candlelight in thick journals, and the quiet visits from correspondents in Charleston who left behind envelopes with no return addresses. Outsiders saw only efficiency and refinement, but those forced to live under her command sensed something colder, something that made them avert their eyes when she walked by. The strange duality of Willow Bend became even more apparent when tragedy began to strike. Between March of 1838 and September of 1839, 17 people connected to the plantation died under circumstances so strange that county officials, doctors, and even local clergy became uneasy. Death was not uncommon in the South. Fevers, accidents, and childbirth claimed lives with grim regularity. But Willow Bend's deaths had a different pattern, one too precise to be coincidence. Men who were once strong collapsed into weakness, their skin turning waxy and their minds fading into confusion. Physicians who attempted to examine them soon destroyed their own records, burning notes as if they were afraid of what they might be accused of documenting. The county clerk went so far as to erase entire pages from official ledgers, leaving blank spaces where names and dates should have been. And when investigators finally came from Savannah in October of 1839, they found themselves met with silence, neighbors refusing to speak, servants suddenly mute, and a community that seemed willing to bury the truth rather than let it come to light. It was as though the entire county understood that what lay at the heart of Willowbend could not be spoken aloud without unraveling the fragile order that held Burke society together. At the center of this silence was Cordelia Rutledge, a woman who had arrived at Willowbend nearly 2 decades earlier as a young bride, and who now stood as its sole authority after her husband's mysterious death. To outsiders, she appeared dignified in her widow's black, a woman fulfilling her duty by managing her late husband's estate until her son came of age. But to those who looked closer, Cordelia's composure seemed unnatural, almost frightening. She showed no grief, no tears, only a methodical focus on maintaining control. And in the weeks that followed, as the plantation's rhythms continued under her command, the earliest whispers began to circulate about what Cordelia was doing before dawn, alone by the waters of Turkey Creek. Servants saw her return with her hair damp, her clothes smelling faintly of chemicals and herbs. The enslaved population noticed the toll taken on 3 particular men handpicked by Cordelia herself, who seemed to wither day by day. What began as gossip soon hardened into fearful certainty. Something was happening at Willowbend, something unspeakable, and it revolved around the mistress of the house and a series of rituals that would soon become the county's darkest secret. Cordelia Vance Rutledge entered Willowbend in 1820 as a 19-year-old bride, and even then, people noticed she was not like the other young women of Burke County. She had come from Charleston, the daughter of a once prosperous shipping merchant whose fortune had dwindled in the embargo years, and her marriage to Thomas Rutledge was as much a contract of survival as it was a union of affection. Thomas needed a capable wife to manage his estate and provide heirs, and Cordelia needed the protection of wealth after her family's decline. Tall for her time, nearly 5'8", with sharp gray eyes and a bearing that suggested quiet authority, she quickly became known among neighbors as efficient, cold, and disciplined to a fault. While other women of her circle delighted in music, embroidery, and gossip, Cordelia's passions lay elsewhere. She hosted elaborate dinners with French recipes she studied in cookbooks, she kept meticulous household accounts, and most curiously, she ordered medical texts from northern cities, books that she read late into the night by candlelight while the rest of the household slept. It was whispered even then that Cordelia's interest in medicine and science was unnatural for a woman, a curiosity that seemed to unsettle her husband and unnerve her servants. Over the years, her reputation only grew more formidable. Willowbend became less of a home and more of a finely tuned machine under Cordelia's direction. She managed every detail, from the linens folded in cupboards to the smokehouse's inventory of salted meat, as though any error would unravel the entire estate. Her children were raised with rigid discipline, expected to sit in perfect order at the supper table and speak only when spoken to. She never struck them, but her presence alone commanded obedience. Her children later wrote in their diaries that her gaze felt like a weight, her silence heavier than scolding. Among the enslaved community, she inspired an even greater fear. She was not known for wild fits of cruelty like some plantation mistresses. She rarely raised her voice. But she watched with an intensity that made people uneasy, examining workers as if she were studying their anatomy. She asked questions about their family histories, their physical ailments, their habits, questions that had little to do with cotton yields or household chores. More than once, enslaved people whispered that Mistress Cordelia looked at them not as human beings but as subjects in some secret experiment. Her marriage to Thomas was never warm, and by 1832 the two had begun sleeping in separate bedrooms, an unusual arrangement for the time. Thomas claimed her habit of writing at night disturbed his rest, but there was more to the separation than quills scratching on paper. By then, Thomas had developed chronic digestive ailments, and though he sought treatment from local physicians, nothing seemed to ease his decline. Meanwhile, Cordelia appeared tireless, keeping the estate running smoothly while secretly filling her journals with cryptic notes about bloodlines, heredity, and the persistence of traits. The correspondence she received from Charleston became more frequent. Letters with no return addresses and shipments from Augusta contained not just spices or fine fabrics, but chemical compounds, mercury, arsenic, tinctures labeled in Latin. She began experimenting with what she called hydrotherapeutic treatments, a phrase no one in Burke County fully understood. All the while, she cultivated a reputation of a composed, capable mistress. But in the privacy of her study, she was slipping into something darker, an obsession with purity, with inheritance, with the possibility that through discipline and science, she could reshape destiny itself. By the time Thomas died in March 1838, Cordelia had already crossed a threshold in her mind. She received the news of her husband's death without tears, calmly arranging the funeral, selecting his burial clothes, and directing servants with clinical precision. But the morning after his burial, she descended into the root cellar and retrieved a locked wooden box she had hidden away. Inside were letters, receipts for medical purchases, and a small black journal bound in leather, evidence of years of study and secret correspondence. From that day forward, Cordelia was no longer simply the iron mistress of Willowbend, a woman feared for her cold gaze and relentless order. She became something else entirely, a woman convinced that her knowledge, her discipline, and her iron will could bend not just her household, but life and death itself to her control. And in that conviction lay the seeds of a ritual that would soon haunt Turkey Creek, a ritual that would blur the lines between medicine, madness, and murder. By the winter of 1837, Thomas Rutledge's decline had become impossible to ignore. Once a robust man who strode through the fields on horseback, cigar in hand and whiskey at his side, he now shuffled through the halls of Willowbend with the frailty of someone 20 years older. He suffered from sharp cramps, relentless indigestion, and waves of nausea that left him bedridden for days. Dr. Silas Peaton, the town physician, visited weekly, prescribing calomel and laudanum, but nothing seemed to halt the wasting. His skin turned a sickly gray, his once broad frame thinning into something skeletal. Yet Thomas never suspected that his decline might be more than natural misfortune. After all, men in Burke County often died young. Fevers, liver disease, and southern wasting were as common as broken fences. To neighbors, Thomas's condition drew little more than polite sympathy. But inside Willowbend, there were whispers among the servants. The master's meals came only from Cordelia's hand, and whatever he swallowed at her urging seemed to sap more strength than it restored. On March 3, 1838, the inevitable arrived. That morning, Josiah Mercer, Thomas's personal servant, entered his chamber to help him dress, only to find him motionless in bed, his face pale and waxy, his breath long gone. Thomas was 52 years old, and his death shocked no one, at least not outwardly. Dr. Peaton declared the cause as acute gastric fever with complications of the liver, the kind of vague diagnosis used so often it sounded almost routine. Within hours, Cordelia assumed control. She did not weep, did not wail, did not falter in her instructions. She ordered the house draped in black crepe, selected Thomas's burial suit with calm precision, and personally drafted his death notice for the local paper. 3 days later, Thomas was lowered into the family cemetery, beside his first wife and parents, as Burke County's most prominent families looked on. Reverend Keyfax spoke of heavenly rest, but those who watched Cordelia through her heavy mourning veil whispered among themselves. Her posture was too steady, her composure too sharp. It was as though she had been preparing for this moment, not devastated by it. But what the mourners did not know, what even the household could not see, was what happened the morning after the funeral. Before the ground above Thomas's grave had settled, Cordelia crept down to the root cellar beneath the kitchen house, where she had hidden a locked wooden box among the vegetables. Inside were years of secrets. Her journals, medical receipts from Augusta, and letters from a mysterious correspondent she referred to as Dr. H. For over an hour she sat in the cold lamplight, reading through them, her face unreadable. Then she tucked them away beneath the loose floorboards of her bedroom closet. This was not the grief of a widow. It was the resolve of someone ready to enact the next stage of a plan. By summoning 3 enslaved men, Isaiah Drummond, Caleb Tucker, and Josiah Mercer, to Thomas's study the very next day, Cordelia revealed that she had been waiting for the moment her husband was gone. She spoke to them calmly, outlining new duties that required secrecy and obedience. They would meet her at Turkey Creek before dawn. They would participate in rituals they could neither refuse nor question. And though she threatened them with the whip, or even the auction block, there was something deeper in her gray-eyed stare. something that told them this was no ordinary order. For the rest of Burke County, Thomas's death was simply another loss in a land where death came early and often. But for Willow Bend, it was the pivot on which everything turned. Without a husband to shadow her, Cordelia had free reign over the plantation, its people, and its hidden experiments. The woman who had always been seen as cold and meticulous now revealed herself as something more dangerous. A mistress with unchecked power, armed with strange books, chemical bottles, and an unyielding belief in her own purpose. In the weeks that followed, the enslaved community would begin to notice Cordelia's new habit. Rising before dawn, her silhouette disappearing into the grove of oaks by Turkey Creek, her hair damp when she returned. And soon, the 3 men she had summoned would begin to change before everyone's eyes. Willow Bend's master was gone, but his death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the nightmare. Isaiah Drummond was the first of the 3 men Cordelia summoned. At 32, he was more than just another enslaved laborer. He was the plantation's master carpenter, the man who kept Willow Bend's vast network of structures intact. Tall, strong, and steady with his hands, Isaiah carried a quiet authority among the enslaved community. He had inherited his skill from his father, a craftsman from Virginia, and his literacy made him exceptional in a place where most enslaved people were denied even the basics of education. He could read building plans, calculate timber cuts, and order supplies, which earned him a small degree of privilege. He had a separate cabin, better rations, and the rare ability to keep part of his earnings when hired out to neighboring plantations. Yet none of that protected him when Cordelia fixed her eyes on him. He bore, like the others, a strange crescent-shaped birthmark on his left shoulder blade, something Cordelia had noticed years earlier and had written about in her journals. When she called him into the study after Thomas's death, Isaiah understood that whatever she intended had nothing to do with carpentry, and everything to do with that cold, appraising stare that seemed to strip him of choice. Caleb Tucker was next. 28 years old and powerfully built, he served as Willow Bend's blacksmith, a man whose strength and precision shaped the iron tools, nails, and hinges that kept the plantation running. Unlike Isaiah, Caleb had been purchased from South Carolina nearly a decade earlier, specifically for his rare skill with metal. He lived apart from the field hands in a small cabin near his forge, the rhythmic pounding of his hammer echoing through the valley at all hours. To most, Caleb was a figure of silent intensity, his focus absolute, his emotions rarely displayed. But Cordelia saw more than muscle and skill when she looked at him. She saw a body that could endure, a vessel for her experiments. Like Isaiah, Caleb carried that same crescent-shaped mark, a detail Cordelia noted with fascination. When she explained his new duties, Caleb clenched his jaw and obeyed. Resistance was impossible. Defiance would mean the auction block or worse. Yet something in his eyes suggested he knew the price he would pay would be greater than lashes. The 3rd man was Josiah Mercer, 26, who had grown up at Willow Bend itself. The son of a house servant named Ruth, Josiah had been groomed from childhood to serve the Rutledge family closely. Unlike most enslaved men, he had been given training in arithmetic, reading, and even the supervision of field hands, a clear sign of Thomas Rutledge's unusual interest in him. To outsiders, Josiah's role as personal attendant made him seem privileged, but those who knew him best understood that such proximity to power was as dangerous as it was advantageous. Cordelia had watched him since boyhood, noting the way he resembled certain features in her own children, features she later convinced herself proved a secret betrayal by her husband. Josiah, too, carried the same crescent-shaped mark, a detail that would grow into an obsession for Cordelia as her rituals deepened. When she summoned him, he obeyed not just out of fear, but with the hollow knowledge that his entire life had been shaped by forces he could never control. Together, Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah formed a trio unlike any other on the plantation, skilled, respected, and marked by a birth sign they did not understand, but Cordelia saw as destiny. They had lived their lives believing that their talents had earned them small privileges, that their relative positions spared them from the harshest brutalities of plantation life. But when Cordelia called them into her late husband's study, sitting stiff-backed behind his mahogany desk, she stripped away whatever illusions they had left. She told them in her calm, measured voice that they were to assist her in a treatment prescribed by a European physician, something that would preserve her health and the legacy of Willow Bend. Her words were not requests, they were declarations. Their bodies, their blood, even their silence belonged to her as surely as the furniture in that room. They were the chosen ones, not by blessing, but by curse, bound into a dawn ritual at Turkey Creek that would soon drain not only their strength, but their very sense of self. And as the first light of morning gathered over the oaks, the three men realized that the lives they had built within Willowbend's walls had ended the moment Cordelia spoke their names. The morning of March 7th, 1838, just 4 days after Thomas Rutledge was laid in the ground, Cordelia walked toward Turkey Creek with a linen bundle tucked under her arm. The air was damp and heavy with fog, the kind that clings to the skin and muffles sound, making even the birds hesitate to sing. Behind her, though at a distance, Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah followed in silence, each man knowing he had no choice but to obey. Turkey Creek wound through the southern edge of Willow Bend, a narrow but powerful stream fed by underground springs, its water cold even in the heat of summer. It was here that the enslaved washed clothes on assigned days, but otherwise the place was avoided. Cypress roots curled into the water like twisted fingers, and shadows clung to the banks as though the trees themselves were guarding secrets. Cordelia led the men to a bend where a flat stone jutted into the current, a natural platform that seemed almost prepared for what she intended. She turned to face them, her voice calm, instructing them to strip and enter the water with her. The words were matter of fact, yet beneath them hung a menace sharpened by the threat she had made clear. Silence or banishment to the Louisiana sugar fields, where life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. Isaiah stepped into the creek first, the cold water rising to his waist, his jaw locked against the shiver that ran through him. Caleb followed, his broad shoulders stiff with tension, the muscles in his arms flexing as if bracing against invisible chains. Josiah came last, and those who later recounted the scene said he looked like a man walking to his own execution. Cordelia removed her dress without hesitation, revealing the pale, unguarded body of a woman who had borne 5 children, and yet carried herself with a strange, almost defiant strength. The men averted their eyes, but she showed no modesty as she stepped into the water, joining them in the current. From the linen bundle, she withdrew objects that seemed more suited for a physician's table than a plantation creek: a straight razor, glass bottles filled with pungent liquids, strips of clean cloth, and a small leather book marked with symbols none of the men recognized. Standing in the circle, Cordelia opened the book and began to chant in a language that sounded like Latin, though twisted and unfamiliar. The words rolled off her tongue in rhythm with the creek's current, steady and deliberate, as though she had rehearsed them countless times. She moved to each man in turn, scooping creek water into her hands and washing them in a ritualistic sequence: shoulders, chest, arms, back, legs. Her touch was clinical, cold, her eyes locked not on their faces, but on their bodies as though she were examining a diagram brought to life. From her bottles, she poured liquids that hissed faintly on the skin, leaving a burning sensation and a chemical smell sharp enough to sting the eyes. As the men gritted their teeth against the discomfort, Cordelia's voice droned steadily, reciting phrases none of them could understand. When she finished washing them, she repeated the ritual on herself, running the stinging liquid over her chest and stomach with an almost reverent intensity. Then she took the razor and, with chilling precision, made shallow cuts on the left shoulder of each man, directly over the crescent-shaped birthmark that all 3 shared. The blood welled in droplets, and she pressed the cloth against it, collecting the crimson stains. With slow, deliberate motion, she smeared the mixture of blood and liquid across her own body, rubbing it into her skin while chanting from the book, her gray eyes shining with a feverish light. To the men, it felt less like a cleansing and more like a theft, as if something was being taken from them and absorbed into her. When the ritual ended, Cordelia instructed them to redress and return to their duties as if nothing had occurred. No acknowledgement, no explanation, only the command that they were to meet her at the creek again the following morning. And so they did, day after day, the dawn ritual repeating with terrifying consistency. Sometimes the procedures shifted: a new liquid, a deeper cut, a different passage from the book. But the core remained the same: the water, the nakedness, the blood, the chant. Each session seemed to draw more from the men than it gave, leaving them weaker, quieter, their once bright eyes turning dull and distant. Isaiah's steady confidence began to crumble, Caleb's strength seemed to drain from his body, and Josiah moved as though he were fading into a fog. To the outside world, life at Willow Bend continued with the same order and discipline Cordelia demanded, but those who looked closely saw the change. Servants whispered in the quarters at night, murmuring of conjure, of root work, of a mistress who had bargained with powers darker than Scripture could name. And all the while, Cordelia thrived. Her energy sharpened, her skin flushed with a strange vitality, as though she were indeed drawing something essential from the men she commanded to join her in the creek each morning. What had begun as ritual soon became a nightmare, one that would consume not only its chosen victims but the very soul of Willow Bend itself. It began with murmurs too soft to carry beyond the cabin walls, late-night conversations spoken in low tones after the day's labor was done. The enslaved community of Willow Bend had long lived under the iron gaze of Cordelia Rutledge, but now they sensed something new, something heavier than discipline, something unnatural. They saw Isaiah, once steady and confident, falter while carrying timber, his hands trembling as though the strength had been drained from his bones. They noticed Caleb, the blacksmith whose hammer once rang like thunder through the valley, now pausing mid-swing to catch his breath, sweat beading on his brow even in the cool of morning. And they saw Josiah, the young attendant who had once been lively with quick wit and sharp memory, staring into space for minutes at a time, his eyes glazed as though he were half asleep. To the field hands, the patterns were too clear to dismiss. "Something's been taken from them," whispered one woman as she rocked her child to sleep. "Mistress ain't just bathing at that creek. She's feeding off them men." The story spread from cabin to cabin, gaining detail with each telling. Some said Cordelia was using conjure, a dangerous root work practice whispered of in the Low Country, one that could steal a man's life force and transfer it to another. Others swore she had struck a bargain with spirits that lived in the creek itself, trading blood for youth. A few whispered of darker things, remembering tales from elders brought from Africa, stories of women who used blood rituals to cheat death. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The three men were fading, and Cordelia was flourishing. She walked with renewed vigor, her skin almost glowing in the candlelight, her step lighter than it had been even in her youth. The enslaved community watched in fear, unable to speak openly, yet unable to ignore what their eyes told them. For them, the rituals at Turkey Creek were not just secret ceremonies. They were proof that the mistress of Willow Bend had crossed into something that no Bible verse, no prayer meeting, no Sunday sermon could touch. Whispers turned to warnings. Mothers told their sons to stay away from the creek after dusk, claiming spirits lingered there, hungry and restless. Men muttered about charms, carrying small pouches of roots, iron nails, and river stones for protection. Some suggested running away, vanishing into the swamps before Cordelia's gaze could fix on them, but others argued that her reach was too long and her wrath too certain. Even the children noticed the change, tugging at their mother's skirts to ask why Isaiah no longer smiled, why Caleb's shoulders slumped, why Josiah seemed to forget their names. And yet, for all the unease, there was silence in the presence of Cordelia. No one dared confront her directly. She moved among them with her usual composure, handing out rations, inspecting cabins, instructing tasks, but now with an added aura, as though she carried a shield of unseen power. When she looked into someone's eyes, they quickly dropped their gaze, afraid that she might choose them next for the rituals that had begun consuming men like shadows devour light. By midsummer, the unease had grown into dread. The rituals at Turkey Creek were no longer whispered rumors. They were accepted as fact within the quarters, even if no one dared say it aloud in the big house. Some of the enslaved began recording the nights and mornings, marking with sticks and stones how often Cordelia disappeared into the mist with her chosen three. Patterns emerged. The weaker the men became, the more vibrant Cordelia appeared. Fear spread like a sickness, not only because of what was happening to Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, but because of what it suggested for everyone else. If their mistress had indeed learned a way to feed herself on the strength of others, then no one was safe. No man, woman, or child on Willow Bend could say for certain that they would not be summoned next. And though voices trembled and eyes filled with terror as the stories passed through the quarters, one truth bound them together. The balance of life at Willow Bend had shifted, and with it, the line between human and monster blurred in the shadow of Cordelia Rutledge's gray eyes. Margaret Rutledge was 17 when her father died, and her mother began the dawn rituals at Turkey Creek. As the eldest daughter, She was expected to step into her father's shadow as a figure of decorum, carrying herself with poise at social gatherings and guiding her younger siblings with quiet authority. But Margaret was not her mother. She lacked Cordelia's icy composure and instead possessed a restless curiosity, a sharp eye for detail, and a tendency to question what others accepted without pause. From her bedroom window on the second floor of Willowbend, Margaret often watched her mother's movements in the dim light of morning. She saw the way Cordelia vanished into the mist at strange hours, the bundle tucked under her arm, her figure swallowed by the trees that lined the creek. At first, Margaret dismissed it as her mother's grief, a private mourning ritual for her father. But when she noticed Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah following at a distance, their shoulders tense, their faces hollow with dread, suspicion took root. What sort of mourning required the presence of 3 enslaved men before the sun even rose? Her unease grew with each passing week. Margaret had always been close to Josiah, who had been her father's personal attendant and often lingered in the halls where she studied. He had once been quick with a smile, eager to fetch her books or answer her curious questions about the plantation. Now he moved like a ghost, stumbling over his duties, forgetting the simplest instructions, his eyes glazed as though he had been drugged. Margaret confronted him gently one afternoon, asking if he was ill, but Josiah lowered his gaze and muttered that he was just tired. The evasiveness cut her deeper than the words themselves. She knew fear when she saw it, and Josiah's silence told her he was terrified of something he could not say. That night, Margaret began writing in her journal, documenting her observations. The change in Josiah's demeanor, the hollow look in Isaiah's eyes, the way Caleb's once powerful frame now seemed to shrink into itself. In careful, looping script, she recorded the times she saw her mother leave the house and the names of the men who followed her. The journal became her secret lifeline, a record of truths too dangerous to speak aloud. One morning, driven by a mixture of fear and defiance, Margaret decided to follow. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she crept down the staircase while the house slept and slipped into the fog before dawn. Keeping a distance, she trailed her mother and the 3 men toward Turkey Creek, her heart pounding with every crunch of leaves beneath her shoes. From behind a cluster of cypress trees, she watched as Cordelia laid out her linen bundle on the flat stone, stripping her dress away with a composure that chilled Margaret to the bone. She saw the razor flash in the dim light, heard the unfamiliar chants, smelled the sharp sting of chemicals wafting through the air. And then she saw the blood, her mother's hand pressing cloth against the shoulders of the 3 men, collecting what should have been their strength and smearing it across her own skin. Margaret clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream, her entire body trembling. This was no mourning ritual. This was something darker, something unspeakable, and it was happening within her own family. After that morning, Margaret could no longer look at her mother the same way. The woman who once seemed merely stern now appeared monstrous, her gray eyes glowing with a secret power that made Margaret shudder. She doubled her efforts with her journal, recording not only what she saw, but how the rituals seemed to affect the men. She noted the days when Caleb nearly collapsed at the forge, the evenings when Isaiah's hands shook so badly he dropped his tools, the moments when Josiah stared blankly at walls as though his soul had been hollowed out. And while she documented, she also began to search. Late at night, she crept into her mother's study, rifling through drawers until she found the black leather book marked with strange symbols. She could not understand the Latin phrases written inside, but she knew instinctively that this was the source of her mother's power. Margaret tucked the knowledge away, waiting for the moment she could reveal it, to her siblings, to the overseer, perhaps even to the county itself. For now, she remained silent, her heart torn between fear of her mother and duty to protect those around her. But the seed of defiance had been planted, and Margaret Rutledge would not let the horrors of Willowbend remain hidden forever. Marcus Flanders had been the overseer of Willowbend for nearly 15 years, a man hardened by the routines of plantation life and loyal to Thomas Rutledge until the master's death. He was not a kind man by any measure. His reputation for strictness kept the enslaved community in line, but he prided himself on efficiency and order, traits that Thomas had valued. After Thomas's passing, Marcus expected the plantation might falter under Cordelia's sole command. To his surprise, Willowbend's rhythms did not collapse. If anything, Cordelia's grip tightened. Every task timed, every harvest neatly accounted for. But Marcus was no fool. He began noticing inconsistencies that gnawed at him. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, three of the plantation's most skilled men, were visibly deteriorating, their work faltering, their strength gone as if drained from their bones. And yet, Cordelia seemed sharper, stronger, as if widowhood had given her new life. At first, Marcus dismissed it as coincidence, but his instincts told him something more sinister was unfolding just beyond his reach. The first true crack appeared one evening when Marcus inspected the forge. Caleb had been tasked with completing a series of iron fittings for a shipment, but the work was sloppy, the kind of mistakes a seasoned blacksmith would never make. Caleb's hands shook as he tried to hammer a hinge into shape, and sweat poured down his face despite the mild spring air. Marcus barked at him, demanding an explanation, but Caleb only muttered that he was tired. Tired? Marcus knew better. He had seen men worked half to death in the fields, yet even they had not wasted away as quickly as these three. That night, Marcus reported the issue to Cordelia, expecting her to discipline the men, or at least feign concern. Instead, she dismissed it with an icy calm. "They are being put to special use," she said, her voice clipped and final, as though the matter required no further discussion. Marcus left her study unsettled. The words "special use" echoed in his mind like a riddle he could not solve. Curiosity soon turned into investigation. Marcus began rising before dawn, wandering the edges of the property with the excuse of checking on stock or repairing fences. It was during one of these early mornings that he saw them. Cordelia moving toward Turkey Creek with her linen bundle, Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah trailing behind her like men walking under a spell. Marcus kept his distance, hiding in the tree line, but what he glimpsed was enough to turn his blood cold. He saw the pale flash of Cordelia's skin as she disrobed, the glint of a razor in the dim light. The three men standing waist-deep in the current, their faces drawn and lifeless. Though the mist obscured the details, he could hear the low murmur of chants, words unfamiliar to him, but carrying a cadence that raised the hairs on his arms. He did not stay long. Fear drove him back toward the house. But the image burned itself into his mind. Whatever Cordelia was doing at that creek was no simple act of grief or mourning. It was something else entirely, something that made Marcus question not only her sanity, but the safety of everyone on Willow Bend. From that day forward, Marcus kept meticulous notes in his own small ledger, a habit he had once reserved for crop yields and labor tallies. He recorded Cordelia's absences, the weakening of the three men, and even the whispered rumors from the quarters that reached his ears. He knew better than to confront her directly. Cordelia was sharp, dangerous even, and any challenge to her authority could cost him his position, perhaps even his life. Instead, he waited, gathering scraps of evidence like a hunter setting traps. He began quietly speaking with Margaret, sensing the girl knew more than she let on. Together, their notes began to form a pattern too precise to ignore. Cordelia's strength grew as the men's lives dwindled. And though Marcus was no scholar, no physician, he understood enough to recognize a truth that chilled him to the core. The mistress of Willow Bend was feeding on her slaves in ways that defied both scripture and sanity. If he did not act soon, the entire plantation, perhaps even the county, would fall under the shadow of her rituals. By autumn of 1839, the facade of Willow Bend could no longer hold. Too many eyes had seen too much, too many whispers had carried from cabin to cabin, and the overseer's ledger had grown heavy with observations that could no longer be dismissed as superstition. Marcus Flanders, hardened though he was, realized the danger had reached a tipping point. The three men, Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, had withered to shadows of themselves. Isaiah collapsed one afternoon carrying timber, his breathing shallow, his lips gray. Caleb nearly dropped a glowing iron bar on a child in the forge. Josiah wandered the halls forgetting not only tasks but his own name at times. Their decline was so visible, so undeniable, that even the neighboring plantations began to murmur. Visitors noted Cordelia's strange vitality, how the widow of 50 looked younger, sharper, more radiant than ever before. Grief has refined her, some said politely, but others looked twice, uneasy at the glow in her eyes and the vigor in her step. Marcus knew the truth, and when Margaret brought him her journal, her neat, desperate records of her mother's dawn rituals. He understood it was time to expose Willowbend's secret, no matter the cost. The confrontation began quietly, almost timidly, with a visit from two physicians summoned from Savannah. Marcus had insisted they be called under the guise of examining Isaiah's collapse. But when they arrived, their questions quickly turned toward Cordelia. Why, they asked, were 3 of the plantation's strongest men wasting away while the mistress thrived? Why did the household smell of sharp chemicals? And why had the family physician, Dr. Peaton, destroyed his own records of Thomas Rutledge's decline? Cordelia received them in her parlor with icy calm, her black dress immaculate, her posture regal. She explained the men's weakness as fevers of the swamp, dismissing their suspicion with rehearsed composure. But when the doctors pressed further, asking to see her journals and her linen bundles, the mask slipped. Her voice sharpened, her gray eyes flashed, and for the first time in public she revealed the fury that burned beneath her restraint. Margaret, standing silently at the edge of the room, watched as her mother's carefully constructed image cracked under the weight of scrutiny. It was the moment she had both dreaded and prayed for, the exposure of a truth too monstrous to conceal. From there, the collapse was swift and violent. Marcus, emboldened by the doctor's doubts, produced his ledger, laying out months of observations that aligned precisely with Margaret's hidden journal. Together, the documents painted a chilling picture. Cordelia's pre-dawn disappearances, the cuts and burns on the men's bodies, the eerie chants by the creek, the correlation between their decline and her unnatural vitality. Faced with such detail, the physicians could no longer look away. They summoned the county magistrate, and soon a hearing was convened in Waynesboro. Neighbors arrived in droves, drawn by both curiosity and fear. Under oath, enslaved men and women testified in hushed tones of what they had seen: the bottles, the blood, the marks on Isaiah's shoulder that would not heal. Some wept as they spoke, others trembled with the risk of defying Cordelia even in public. Yet with each voice the web of silence unraveled. Cordelia's defense was fierce. She insisted it was grief, misunderstood remedies, the inventions of frightened servants, but her composure no longer convinced. The county, once so willing to look away, now stared directly into the abyss she had created. By December of that year, Cordelia Rutledge's reign at Willowbend had ended. Declared unfit to manage her estate and mentally unsound, she was confined under the watch of her brother's household in Charleston. The courts avoided calling her rituals witchcraft. Such a word carried too much danger in a society that prided itself on refinement. But the whispers told otherwise. To the enslaved community, she was remembered not as a grieving widow, but as a predator who had stolen the very lifeblood of her men. To the neighbors, she became a scandal best spoken of only in private, a tale that stained the reputation of an entire county. Willowbend itself fell into decline, its fields neglected, its great house dimmed by the absence of the woman who had ruled it with icy precision. But for those who had lived beneath her shadow, the collapse was not just the fall of a mistress. It was the ending of a nightmare. And yet, as Margaret and Marcus both knew, endings are never so clean. The land still held the echoes of what had been done by Turkey Creek, and the memory of Cordelia's gray eyes lingered like a curse that no court ruling could erase. In the months after Cordelia Rutledge was removed from Willowbend, the plantation sank into a silence it had never known before. The dawns were no longer marked by her figure disappearing into the fog, no chants carried over the creek, no blood drawn beneath the shadow of the cypress trees. Yet for those who remained, the absence of ritual did not erase the memory of what had been endured. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah never fully recovered. Isaiah lived another 2 years, his body frail, his once steady hands unfit for carpentry. Caleb, stripped of the strength that had once defined him, died suddenly in the forge one summer afternoon, his heart failing mid-strike. Josiah survived the longest, but he was never the same. His sharp mind dulled, his laughter gone, his gaze distant as though a part of him had been left behind in the waters of Turkey Creek. Among the enslaved, these men became symbols of survival and sacrifice, not martyrs in the traditional sense, but reminders of how power, when twisted into obsession, could consume even the strongest souls. For Margaret, the legacy of her mother's crimes became a burden she could not escape. Though she had exposed the truth, though her careful journals had broken the silence, she bore the stigma of being Cordelia's daughter. At church gatherings, neighbors whispered behind their fans, their eyes darting to her with pity and suspicion. Suitors withdrew, reluctant to align themselves with a family so tainted by scandal. Yet Margaret endured, retreating into books and private prayer, determined that her voice would not be lost to history. Years later, fragments of her journals would surface in county archives, their pages fragile but still legible, providing rare insight into the unraveling of Willowbend. It was through her hand that the world came to understand what had transpired, not in the fevered exaggerations of rumor, but in the measured, desperate notes of a daughter who had watched her mother descend into darkness. Margaret's courage ensured that Cordelia's rituals would not vanish into silence, but live on as a warning about what unchecked power and grief could create. The land itself seemed marked by the events. Turkey Creek, once just another stretch of water winding through Burke County, gained a reputation that outlasted generations. Enslaved families told their children never to wander near its banks, warning that the water remembered blood and would claim anyone foolish enough to trespass after dark. Neighbors avoided it too, muttering of strange sounds in the fog, of a woman's voice chanting in the distance when no one should have been there. Even after emancipation, long after Willowbend's fields had gone to ruin, and its great house stood in disrepair, the creek carried its curse. Hunters swore their dogs refused to approach it, and old-timers in the county claimed that fish caught from its waters tasted bitter, as though touched by something unnatural. Whether superstition or truth, the stories kept the memory alive, turning Turkey Creek into a living monument to the horror of what Cordelia had done. Today, Willowbend exists only in fragments. A collapsed chimney here, a moss-covered foundation stone there. The land has been parceled and sold, its history buried beneath the plow of modern farms. But for those who know the story, the ruins are not just relics of antebellum grandeur, they are markers of a legacy written in blood. Cordelia Rutledge's name has faded from public record, but in the private histories of Burke County, she remains a figure of dread, a woman who blurred the line between science and superstition, between grief and madness until she became something monstrous. Her story is not just about one plantation, one family, or even one county. It is a reflection of how power, when unchecked, corrodes the soul, how secrets rot beneath polished facades, and how the hunger to control fate can destroy not only lives but entire legacies. And as long as the waters of Turkey Creek flow through Georgia soil, the memory of Willowbend's mistress lingers, a chilling reminder that some histories are too dark to ever truly fade.